Thank you for joining Ensuring Meaningful Access to Services for Survivors with Limited English Proficiency by Jose Juan Mora and Lumari Ozorco from Casa de Esperanza. Jose Juan has been involved in the movement against gender violence since 1999 and has facilitated workshops at national, state, and local conferences on crisis intervention, systems advocacy for victims of family and sexual violence, and LGBTQ victims of interpersonal violence. Prior to coming to the National Latina Network, Jose Juan was the Senior Victim Services Program Specialist for the Texas Advocacy Project in Austin, Legal Advocate Program Coordinator for the Friendship of Women Incorporated in Bronzeville, Case Manager, Supervisor, and Volunteer Coordinator for Court-Appointed Special Advocates of Cameron and Wilkesee counties, and the Director of Legal Services for the Family Crisis Center Incorporated in Harlingen. Jose Juan serves on the Board of Directors for the Texas Victim Services Association and ALGO, a statewide queer people of color organization, originally Austin Latino, lesbian, and gay organization, and a consultant for the Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center. Lumari is a community psychologist and project manager for the Latina Network for Healthy Families and Communities, a project of Casa de Esperanza. Lumari's areas of expertise and interest include Latino youth development and advocacy, community leadership, community engagement, language access, organizational development, including assessment and capacity building, and the development and implementation of culturally responsive interventions that target Latina communities. Lumari works with nationally recognized colleagues and other national technical assistance providers to inform the practices of the country's most innovative community-based and dynamic nonprofit organizations to achieve dramatic social change in the fields of dating and domestic violence and sexual assault. Currently, Lumari provides training and strategic technical assistance services to the Domestic Violence Homicide Prevention Initiative, which seeks to enhance the response to high risk for lethality of victims of domestic violence from racially and ethnically diverse communities. Previously, Lumari managed Casa de Esperanza's community engagement initiatives, including Fuerza Unidad and the Youth Initiatives. Lumari is a 2011 Practitioner Fellow with the National Institute on Out-of-School Time and the 2012 Practitioner Fellow with the Robert Brown Foundation National Writing Project. From PCAR, we thank you for joining us on this journey as we engage ourselves into learning more about language access to better serve victims and survivors.
Thank you, Tatiana. Again, my name is Jose Juan Lara Jr., and I'm one of your presenters today, and I'm joined by my colleague, Lumari Orozco. Today's webinar is the first in a series of 3. The next webinar will be talking about actually how to develop a language access plan, the details around that. And then the last webinar in the series will include a conversation. It's basically a Q&A or question and answer in case folks had any questions on this particular webinar on how to develop a language access plan. So the last webinar really is dedicated to just providing an open space for dialogue for participants to answer any questions they may have around how to do that. So, a little bit more about Casa Esperanza. Before I continue, I want to thank PCAR for inviting us to do this work with you all here today. Language access is one of the major issues, or one of the several issues that Casa Esperanza addresses. So Casa Esperanza actually was founded back in 1982, focusing around domestic violence, services, and advocacy for survivors in St. Paul, Minnesota. We have different focuses around our mission. One of them is around Latino leadership, entrepreneurship, organizational excellence, and of course, living free of violence and community-driven solutions. At the basis of the work that we do at Casa Esperanza is always about community engagement. We always check in with community in regards to our own programming and program development, and sometimes that can be very challenging and interesting as well. But again, the basis of our work is based on community engagement and understanding that it is through community and with community and by community that we will end these forms of gender-based violence. As far as the National Latina Network, it's a project of Casa Esperanza that works towards ending violence and promoting the health and well-being of Latino communities around the country. Under the National Latina Network, we have 3 pillars that we work on: public policy, research, training, and technical assistance. And we're also acknowledged under the Office on Violence Against Women as one of the culturally responsive resource centers around ending domestic violence. Of course, our focus within Latino communities, but we've also discovered a lot of the work that we do does apply across communities as well. So I always like to start off with some guiding principles. As you all know, anytime we do any type of work around the intersections of identity, in this case around gender-based violence and folks with limited English proficiency and so on, a lot of things come up for folks. So it's always good to start out with some guiding principles. And I know that we have the barrier of time and space between us, but we'll definitely try to make this as engaging and as interactive as possible. But as part of that is just be mindful of your thoughts, reactions, and body language. Reflect on your own privilege and biases. Create and maintain a safe learning space. Be self-aware. Share the space as much as you can. Honor diversity and try to be present. I know that sometimes with online or virtual learning, there's always a temptation of doing multiple things, and I totally get that, having been a participant in several webinars, but try to be present as much as you can. I know webinars are convenience, but just try to be present as much as you can with this conversation. So as part of the engagement process, and please put your answers in the chat box below. We have a couple of questions we want to ask folks before we delve into the conversation. So we'll take a couple of minutes on each question. So the first question is, does your organization or agency have bicultural, bilingual staff? So if you can please just type in the chat box yes or no. That would be awesome. And again, this is just a sense of, to get a sense of things for folks that, and the type of conversation that we're having today. Okay, so folks are saying yes for the most part. Mostly no, but we are attempting to hire in that direction. Okay, awesome. Yes, but limited languages. Thank you for the honesty. All right. So just continue answering. So let's move on to the next question. Have you ever tried to learn a different language? Just yes or no. So folks are saying yes, not really. Okay. All right. And then the last question, is the language you speak tied to your identity? Yes or no. And we'll have more conversations around this particular question. Folks are saying yes. A lot of folks are saying yes. Okay, thank you. And again, because we're just not talking, this particular webinar is around engaging more significantly around the intersections of language as a cultural identity. I think we just wanted to start with those questions just to find out where folks are at. And particularly for the second question, have you ever tried to learn a different language? Certainly, I have a lot of friends who have done that in the past, attempted to learn another language and expressing a lot of challenges around that as well. So just to get us into that mindset of trying to engage in the conversation around language as part of cultural identity. All right. So examining culture. I think before we get into that piece around the intersections of language and cultural identity and so on and gender-based violence, I think we definitely want to get into a leveling conversation about examining culture and how it impacts our work. Because again, we all may have different ways of how we define culture and how we examine culture. So just starting with the first question, and again, please put your answers in the chat box. What is culture? What is culture for you? How do you define culture? And again, this may seem like a baseline question, but again, we all may define culture very differently, maybe some similar definitions. So folks are putting traditions, food, clothing, language, music, yes. Some folks are responding a set of values, traditions reinforced by people around us, religion and community, of course. So as people continue, where I come from, yes. So just keep on answering the question. We'll move on to the next. Why do we need to know about culture? So folks can, again, indulge me in responding in the chat box. Why do we need to know about culture as part around language access and developing a language access plan in our organization? Why do we need to know about culture? We need to understand where others are coming from, correct? Better understanding of self and others. So there's a lot of similar responses coming up, understanding ourselves, understanding others. Thank you for sharing. People don't experience the world the same way all the time, so reaching people is about more than opening the door. Yes, and hopefully we'll have more conversations around that to the limitations of time and space that we have. So going on to the next question, and please continue to respond. Why does culture matter? Why does culture matter? So we've talked about what is culture, why do we need to know about culture. Now, last question, why does culture matter? And I think some of the responses for the previous one kind of intersect with this last question. Appreciation for understanding someone else's beliefs and values, yes. And again, some of these responses kind of may be similar, but in thinking about culture, we were very intentional about these questions and trying to teasing the level of culture and how we define that. It is part of what forms us, even if it doesn't completely define us. That is true, and a lot of times around definition of the other is based on assumptions of about what we may have or what little knowledge or information we have around the other or different communities or diverse communities. Informs who an individual is, correct, but also collectively we have to engage in that conversation that culture may also define a universe of communities and then how that translates to the individual person and how that individual person engages with all these different circles of society. All right, thank you for sharing. So moving on in the conversation, and I don't know if some of you have seen, if you've seen this, the cultural iceberg, if you can just please write yes or no in the chat box. But sometimes when we start engaging in the conversation around culture, we often stay at a very surface level of the conversation because in my very humble opinion, that's where the safe part of it stays. But when we start delving into a deeper conversation around culture, we start defining or reframing our own assumptions, our own perceptions around what we have learned around communication styles and the rules around communication styles. And again, we all, depending on the role that you play in your organization, even whether it's in your personal lives or professional lives, we all have all learned these rules around engagement, around communication styles, and what does that look like. And certainly, for those of us who provide advocacy at whatever level that may be in your organization, a lot of that, whether we're interfacing or engaging survivors in different systems of help, their interpretation of their communication may be read differently or perceived differently. So looking that more deeper into that role of communication styles and rules. And again, language access is all about that, or some of that. Notions of courtesy and manners, leadership, modesty and beauty. Again, how people dress. Certainly we all have different perceptions of what beauty is, what is attractive, and then we base a lot of perception and assumption on how people dress. And again, that's also communicated how people express their gender identity or not. And then when we delve deeper into concepts of culture, concepts of self-time, past and future, fairness and justice, and I think when we're talking about advocacy, particularly around increasing language access, which is a form of justice or human right, we start making sure that people have the ability to communicate their fears, their concerns to us, and it is our obligation to be able to comprehend what they're communicating to us based on language that different communities may speak, not only their language of origin, but also different communities have developed their own codes of language just around safety issues. And certainly as professionals or people who are advocates or who may identify as advocates, we've developed our own jargon around systems of help, even within advocacy, and how does that look like. And of course, attitudes towards elders, adolescents, relationships, and so on. Even death, the concept of death and dying is so important. And what does that look like? And then approaches to, courtship, marriage, certainly for a lot of us who work around intimate partner violence, for a lot of folks, faith places a lot of importance around their relationships, whether it's an intimate partner relationship or, it's just within the community, how the community sees relationships, whether it's intimate partnerships or within family and the context of family, and how does that look like. But when we start delving deeper, we start having more significant conversations. And so the crucial understandings about culture and defining it is so important. Ideas of race are constructed and have fostered superficial identity stereotypes. Again, what we've learned and based on where we come from. Again, everyone has culture, but it can be hard to see sometimes. And what does that look like? And then we're all interconnected at some level. We all share some similar experiences based on the community we live in, and then the individual interpretation of that, and how does that feel for that individual, and then ourselves as groups. And then it's just becoming more aware of culture helps us to appreciate diversity and know ourselves more deeply. And again, when we start having more deeper conversations around what is culture, how do we define culture, and so on, we start revealing our own selves within that conversation around our own, particularly around the limitations of our understanding of the other. And then the big question becomes, do I have culture? So again, if you can indulge me in the chat box, do you think you have culture, yes or no? Because I think that's a very important question to also ask ourselves, not just defining what is culture, but also reframing the lens on ourselves is that, yes, do I have culture or no, I don't have culture, right? And that in itself is a very enigmatic question to ask because, what do you mean by culture? Do I have culture? Yes. So what does that mean? And what do you mean by asking this question? If we were together in the same space, we would definitely have this activity, right? But what is culture? The sum of attitudes, customs, and values and beliefs that distinguishes one group of people from the other. Again, starting with a very baseline understanding of that. Culture is transmitted through language, behaviors, rituals, institutions. Again, in this case, we're emphasizing the issue around language, right? And then how you absorb culture is through heritage, roots, the culture you are immersed in that contributes to your values, beliefs, and ways of thinking and doing, just looking at those things. But then when we start, again, revealing the layers of what do I have culture, is we start asking the questions, how do you identify in this conversation, right? How does your culture shape you in this conversation? And again, referencing back around language access. How does culture shape the way you see yourself and others in the world? What are some of the most important values in your culture and to you personally? Because again, a lot of us who do this work around helping others, I think we all have the shared commonality of we want to help others, right? But how does that translate that? What are some of the most important values in my culture and to you personally? How does that transmit in our advocacy daily? And again, referencing back to language access. How does culture shape how you may relate to others in your work? Again, language is a very big part of that. Are you able to communicate? And again, just putting it in the reference or the concept of professional language that we use with each other. Sometimes it's very different, and it varies from state to state. And a lot of us my professional experience has been around engaging survivors within the criminal justice system, and primarily the court system. And a lot of times every jurisdiction, I come from Texas, and we have the same set of laws, but every jurisdiction may interpret the law very differently and create different terminology or abbreviations and so on. And again, communication is an essential part of that language and so on. So very essential around this conversation around language access. So we get into examining language as identity, and then again, how it impacts our work. So again, in the attempt to being engaging around webinar, and again, if we can indulge in answering these questions, what is the relation between language and identity? Again, there's no right or wrong answer. We can just, again, what is the relationship between language and identity? People can perhaps share your answers in the chat box. And as folks are responding, because again, in preparing for this webinar, I had to really thinking about the intersections of language and identity and how does that play out in the work that we do. So I think a lot of times in having internal conversations with my colleagues here, we've had to deal with not just about how to develop a language access plan, but also looking at how is language as part of cultural identity, right? So what is the relationship between those two things? Okay. So, Aaron says the world may give you an identity whether accurate or not based on language, correct? And a lot of times we perceive a lot of things based on just people who may speak with an accent. So just continue responding to that question. So moving on to the next question. How does your language affect your identity? Right? And I kind of mentioned that sometimes, if you speak with an accent, that may cause a lot of perceptions about who you are and where you come from. So how does your language affect your identity? Certainly, I myself, as being bilingual Spanish, I sometimes have an accent depending on what part of the state I'm at. And certainly when I'm speaking to folks who are in the middle or East Texas, I sometimes speak with a twang. It's very unconsciously that I do that. And even in folks who have been in different parts of the country, people will say that I speak with an accent. And I say, what kind of accent is that? So people are saying it can give a sense of unity across wide swaths of cultures. It places you into a category. A lot of shared responses being put in the chat box. And the last question, how does language define a community's identity and power? I think this is essential to the conversation around language access. Because I think a lot of times, and I've said this to many of my peers who are advocates, we are the gatekeepers to a lot of systems of help. And because we're able to communicate depending on the system of help and their professional jargon that they use, we're able to engage survivors into different systems of help. But that's just one facet of it. Then we also have to look at the language of the community. Do they speak another language other than English? And again, you know, we're familiar around power and control issues, right? And if you don't have the ability to communicate, it does hinder, it may undermine a community's identity and power if we don't value people who speak different languages other than English. And certainly in recent times, we have seen a lot of social media accounts around people being attacked, verbally being attacked for speaking another language other than English, right? And so what does that look like and how does that feel? Particularly for a lot of us, and again, I identify as Latino who is also bilingual in Spanish, how does that impact me as an advocate, as a person who is maybe trying to increase language access for a survivor who doesn't speak English at a very basic level, or may have some understanding of the language, or may speak with a heavy accent when they speak English, or so on. So again, looking at these questions and really looking at how language defines a community's identity and power. And so in looking at that relationship, at that intersection, language does not exist in isolation. Language is part of culture, as some of you have already shared, right? Language and culture are at the core of all human society. This is how we communicate with each other. You know, when we share the common quote-unquote language, we share so many things. We are able to communicate freely with each other. We find comfort and we find safety. Language is a symbolic system through which people communicate and transmit culture. Again, you know, putting myself as an example, when I go back home, because I'm able to speak in Spanish, I can communicate with my elders who only speak Spanish, and they're able to transmit the histories of my family and their families and how I carry on those traditions and how I carry on that strength. And again, building the foundation of my strength and of my community around language and the ability to communicate, and also understanding the privilege that I have around being able to being able to speak another language other than Spanish, but also being able to speak English, and looking at that specific relationship. And again, talking about language, identity, and privilege, as I mentioned before, because some of us have that duality of being able to speak other languages, you know, not just English, there is a sort of privilege around that. There is a sort of power around that. I have an ability to be able to, and based on my own professional experiences when I would accompany survivors to the court around hearings, whether it's a divorce hearing or an order of protection hearing, you know, and having the privilege of living in a border town where everyone spoke Spanish, and there was this fluidity around people engaging with a survivor in Spanish or in English or whatever language they were comfortable speaking in. You know, there was some power around that. There was some safety around that. When I would recruit lawyers, pro bono lawyers that spoke Spanish, they were able to communicate with the survivor around these issues, around engaging the court system, the level of comfort that created automatically, right? And so there's some power and privilege around that, and we have to acknowledge that. I was going to show you a video. Unfortunately, because of different internet speeds, we're going to forego the video, but you have the link to it. You can look at it, and Tatiana just shared it there in the chat box. You can look at it, but the basic premise of the video is it's a BuzzFeed video on YouTube. I don't know if you're familiar with BuzzFeed, but sometimes they have these very interesting videos, and it's basically of children of immigrant parents sharing their stories around some of the challenges they had growing up as children, watching their own parents struggle around language and communication and access to different systems, whether it's a system of help, whether it's employment or so on, and also experiencing some of that backlash of not being able to speak the language, and how personal it was for them having to experience that. And then now as adults, having pride in that they're now able to help their own parents, but then just the initial struggles around, or the challenges around that being young, which is something often we hear of when we have survivors who don't speak English having other people translate on their behalf, or systems not having interpreters in court systems that translate for the survivor and so on. Again, we've all heard those stories, but I just wanted to share that video with you all. And once you watch the video, definitely ask yourself these questions. What did you see? What did you feel? What were some of your initial reactions to the video? Were you reacting to the video, or were you triggered by the video and what was shared? Certainly for me, when I watched the video, it was very personal. Again, someone who identifies with the Latino community and who is bilingual Spanish, and being exposed to what's happening around me, it definitely, I was reacting to the video. It was not something that was uncommon to me, even though I lived in a border town where everyone spoke Spanish, and I had that freedom and I had that power and that identity around language access. But then, not living in a border town anymore, encountering those issues and what does that mean for us? And again, framing that conversation as an advocate, and how does that, or in my advocacy work, and whatever role you may have in the organization, how does that transmit around increasing language access for survivors of gender-based violence? So, so language, a community's identity and power, maintenance of a minority language within a majority culture such as Spanish in the U.S. is often associated with maintenance of a minority's values and with the continuation of its unique cultural identity. As I mentioned before, because I have the privilege of being bilingual Spanish, I can communicate with my family. I can communicate with friends who also speak English, and being the bridge around that conversation, and then how I applied that experience in my advocacy work, right? Loss of language can also be associated with a loss of cultural identity. Languages can be lost for a variety of reasons. Certainly for a lot of us who may identify as immigrants to this country, or who may be bilingual, a lot of us had to learn how to not speak another language out of survivor in order to survive, because of the consequences around that. And again, on the daily, there'll be another YouTube video, another Facebook video around someone being attacked because they don't speak other than English. And as social conditions change, may be imposed and others suppressed by dominant power. Again, we see it. I see it every day. Every time I open my Facebook, there's another act of violence happening to someone else who doesn't speak English or speaks with a heavy accent. So again, just looking at that intersectionality and that foundational piece around a community's identity and power around language. And so reframing these three intersections, of course, language, and in this case we're talking about gender-based violence, and in the context of sexual assault or sexual violence, and how does that transmit to identity. And again, violence around a person's inability to speak the language comes in so many different ways. I have seen it play out in the court system many a time. And I've seen, you all have also heard the stories. But just being intentional about looking at these three intersections and how they all play out for this person, or these communities, or other communities that we may not identify with, or we do identify with. And again, how does that reframe in our advocacy work? How is that exposed in the work that we do with survivors of gender-based violence? And part of that conversation is around talking about cultural competency. And what does that look like? And I think I have a little difficult time around this term, cultural competency, but then really looking at how cultural competency is just the beginning of understanding, quote unquote, the other. I think cultural competency, when we go to trainings and conferences that teach us about differences of others or differences between others, or myself and others. It's really about cultural competency. But when we talk about language access and we put this framework around cultural competency, it just stays there. It just tells us around how we're different from each other around, in this case, language access, or the ability to communicate. Cultural competency is the beginning of perhaps setting policy that increases access. But again, it just stays at the framework around differences. We just focus that, oh, they speak a different language. We have to create a language access plan. But it goes beyond that. We have to step a little bit further than just that. We have to go around talking about cultural responsiveness. When we move beyond cultural competency, where it just teaches us about how different we are from each other, cultural responsiveness actually begins to delve into that conversation about my willingness and my eagerness to learn about the other, not just learning about how we're different, but also being eager and willing to learn and engage in conversation about why are those differences in place? Why is this survivor reacting a certain way? Why? I mean, we can apply it in so many different ways, right? But when we start looking at cultural responsiveness, we start asking that question for ourselves and really be proactive and intentional about why these differences and respecting those differences, right? We may never have an understanding completely, but at least there is a beginning on the conversation. And part of it, again, when we reframe it on us, in challenging ourselves in this discovery around cultural responsiveness, we start learning where our limitations are. And again, based on assumptions of the other. And then we get into the level of cultural humility, which again is a lifelong process. All these three levels, and I see them as these levels of getting to that point of cultural humility. Is we stop resisting, or we stop identifying or labeling folks based on something, on an assumption or what have you. And I know that we are in systems of help that kind of train us to classify people. If you look at our intake processes, if you look at our intake applications, there's always this checkbox we have to fill out in order to qualify the person to meet services. And a lot of times, these intake processes that we have does not allow for expression to be flexible, or unless you fit this mold, you can't fit the service. But when we start applying, going beyond being culturally competent around understanding what's different from us, being culturally responsive, which is around engaging, oh, I want to learn more about what those differences are, to cultural humility, really looking at, I'm going to challenge myself not to label this person. I'm going to let them self-identify however they feel comfortable. And I also understand, folks, that we also work within systems that do have categories, that do have requirements in order for folks to gain access to those services, and I get that. But when we're providing advocacy at our crisis centers or social service centers, we should allow folks that ability. And again, it also means that we need to look at ourselves and how we're being humbly approaching this person, and understanding information provided by the person. And then when we start doing that, and by the way, you're already doing it, right? If we just look at the concept around providing advocacy or help for survivors of sexual-based violence, gender-based violence, our amazing training teaches us you don't call a survivor a sexual assault victim unless they claim that identity, right? You call them by their name. How do they wish to identify? We don't put those labels automatically on them. Of course, we sometimes have to have a conversation with a survivor around what that label may be represented in the system of help we need to engage with in order to gain access. But within our own organizations, when we apply cultural humility, we don't have to do that. And again, I get it. We have grant deliverables. We have to meet numbers. But just giving that respect for the person, allowing them to identify as how they wish. And again, it goes back to language access. as an organization, being culturally humble and understanding that I don't understand the language, but I have to gain some knowledge around how can I increase the system to be accessible for this person. So looking at language access, not just from I need to develop a plan, but also looking at it as being culturally responsive through language justice. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term language justice, but with language justice, which I think goes back to cultural humility, it promotes autonomy and self-determination by making sure that everyone's voice is heard and that all that the transmitted information is relayed. Again, language justice creates linguistically democratic spaces where no one language is privileged so that people can meet as equals regardless of their primary language. Teaches the interpretation is not in the service of the non-English speakers, but rather for everyone that does not share a common language. Because at the end of the day, as those of us who identify as advocates or who do advocacy work, it's about keeping someone safe from harm, whatever that looks like for that person, or whomever it looks like for that person, right? And a lot of times, when we engage in those systems of help, it's often that's where a lot of our work around language access comes into play, right? And making sure that that court has interpreters and scheduling around that and making sure interpretation is available. Or if a person has to go to a community health clinic and making sure that they have people that can communicate with this person at some level of understanding or comprehension, if not understanding. Again, and going beyond and just really delving deeper into language justice. And again, creating multilingual spaces, right? And how do you do that? Well, you look at your hiring practices and you know who is in your community that speaks different languages. Querying the language, also making sure that when you speak to someone, you don't assume their gender identity and expression. Ungendering language. This is something that we've had challenges around, particularly around the issue around domestic violence or intimate partner violence. A lot of times we assume that the abusive partner may be male, and so the language we use is around male-identified abusive partners. Not to say that's not true. You know, we know the statistics, 90% of the time, you know, so on. But again, making sure we are ungendering language when we're approaching folks. Decentering monolingual-only practices, right? And again, this is when we really started applying language justice concepts, is really making sure, again, that it's not it's in the benefit of everyone, that we all understand and communicate with each other at a better level. And then, again, when we reframe the conversation on us, you know, understanding cultural identity and our work, it's who are you in this conversation? And I often, again, share with a lot of my peers that we often, when we go to trainings or conferences, they teach us about how survivors need to access us, when in fact it should be the other way around, right? We should be learning how we're more accessible to others, how we're more accessible to different communities, not just around language access, but just diverse communities that come from different walks of life. You know, who are you in this conversation? Who is this person that I'm having the conversation with? How do you see the person as they see you? Because again, when you reframe the lens and put it back on us, it's like, oh wow, it's a two-way street conversation. What is the context of your work and the principles that guide it? Again, this comes up again. And how do all these things come together in this conversation for you as the gatekeeper, as the provider, as the advocate, whatever title you may have, even in your role as a finance person? You have to understand why you're providing language access, why it's so important, why it's so essential. And again, it impacts at all levels of the organization. But again, reframing the concept on us and how does it work for us, and how do all these things about our assumptions around language and language access and people who speak a different different language or speak in an accent, how does that come forward in our work that we do? And so just putting a finer point on it, we look at the survivor at the middle of all these things. So you may have a survivor with limited English proficiency. And so a lot of times when we work in our respective organizations, we often think our service plans, and I'm just using that terminology, it's the only thing that this person is doing. They're not. They're engaging different people with different expectations, different regulations, requirements for them to qualify for the service, right? But again, you know, it's challenging enough when you do understand the language, but then we complicate it by our different respective fields of profession. When we have our own internal language, like lawyers have legalese, and, you know, the whole legal system has their own jargon around, you know, court orders and so on, and processes around the legal system. You know, certainly in the realm around advocacy, we have our own internal language, abbreviations, and so on. But then imagine when the person may not have the ability to speak the language, or limited in speaking the language or in communication. How does that look like for this person? And again, the success of our advocacy relies on the collaboration of others. And so if you're collaborating with someone, you know, in law enforcement or in some school trying to gain access or services for the person you're trying to help, or the family you're trying to help, or the community you're trying to help, are they at the same level around understanding what language access means and what does it look like? And has that organization or system dealt with whatever internalized ism they're projecting on this person, or bias, or whether it's implicit or explicit bias? Again, putting a bigger frame on this conversation, because again, the success of our advocacy is so dependent on collaboration with others. And when our peers are not at the same level of understanding what language access is and how decentering language, just not an English-only kind of conversation, but broader than that, you know, it could be challenging for the person. And again, this person's life isn't put at risk when we don't have that understanding. So again, part of our advocacy, you thought we had, and I get it, you know, we have more than enough work to do, but now we have this extra level of, oh my God, language access. Again, at the end of the day, it's a person's life at stake. So looking at this from a very broader picture, not just from ourselves, and again, how collaboration is so important in that conversation. We've come to the end of this dialogue. Are there any questions? And again, this is just the beginning of the conversation. Certainly, we can go for hours around just talking about language and as a cultural identity and so on. But again, we just wanted to offer this beginning conversation to get people in this framework or frame of mind that developing a language access plan is so much more than, okay, we need to develop it. You really have to delve deeper as an organization, as an individual representing your organization or your particular system of help, how this is so much more than just that, right? So I will open it up for questions or discussions. Folks may have. Tatiana, do you have any questions? People are thinking.
Thank you, Jose. That was really great. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, and I will be able to send out the PowerPoint in a PDF version after the webinar. And we'll give people a few minutes to submit any questions they may have.
And definitely want to be very clear with folks that this is challenging work, and then again, as I mentioned before, we have a lot of work to do as it is in our daily places of employment. And certainly at Casa Esperanza, our intent is not to say, this is what you need to do this. No, we're just here to provide an open space for dialogue. Certainly at Casa Esperanza, we're always improving the way we deliver our services, even though, primarily working with Latino communities, and a lot of our staff are bilingual in Spanish. It doesn't mean that the work ends for us. It is always, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we always check in with community. Community engagement principles is, again, the foundation of the work that we do. It's sometimes very challenging because sometimes we may have this direction we think we're doing so well in leading, but then we check back in with community, and community says, nope, this is what we want instead of this. So those can be very challenging conversations. But again, we're not here to tell you you're doing it wrong. We're here about providing a space of conversation and dialogue, and how can we do this? How can we create spaces that are mindful around people's different abilities of communication and engaging with different systems of help, again, under this foundation of language access. But it's so much more than just what the federal law says, what the state law says. It is so much more than that. And again, someone who does identify as Latino and does speak bilingual Spanish, a lot of this does influence the work that I do now, and now seeing the significance of that. And so again, how do I improve myself? And then how do I become an ally for others in this work as well? So definitely this is not about pointing fingers or this is how you need to do it. It's about working with what you got, but really looking beyond just another, I need to develop another thing or I need to put something into place, which is important, but it's so much more than that. And again, as I mentioned before, a lot of us do this work is because we want to help others at the best way we know how. But we really have to internally look at our own selves individually, and then how we do that as cohesively as a bigger part of your organization. So. So I don't think there's any other questions. Tatiana, do you have anything else?
No. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and presenting such valuable information. If anyone has any questions that they think of over the next few weeks, or things that come to mind, please don't hesitate to reach out to Casa de Esperanza, and also reach out to PCAR, and we can always flood those questions to Casa for further training and technical assistance.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone, and hope you have an amazing rest of the week.
Yes, thank you all for joining us.